Kirk, and the change in premiership from Neville Chamberlain to Winston Churchill immediately after that invasion in May 1940 to what was called the Battle of Britain. Now, the Battle of Britain is unique in a number of ways. First of all, it was the first battle in history, major battle, decisive battle that was fought between two air forces. Secondly, it was the first major battle that was observed by the population for whom it was being fought while they watched on the ground. Thirdly, it was the first battle that was given a name before it started. And fourthly, it was the first battle that was declared over before it had ended. So the battle itself, if you look at the official records as set by the civil servants of the day, was between the 10th of July and the 31st of October 1940. Now, those are totally arbitrary dates set by somebody in the Air Ministry or wherever during the war. And those were the dates that were established, which decided whether the participants in the battle would receive a clasp, which went on their 1939-45 star, their medal, which said Battle of Britain, campaign clasp. And those men, and they were all men, both aircrew and pilots, because a number of the squadrons had Bristol Blenheims, which carried crew, they became what Churchill famously called the few. But in order to qualify for that accolade, for want of a better word, that clasp on their medal, they had to have served one operational sortie with a unit within fighter command of the Royal Air Force between the 10th of July and the 31st of October. And then they were forever after known as one of the Battle of Britain few. Now, there's a couple of rules in public speaking, and as Sean said, I've been doing this for quite a few years. And one of them in acting or public speaking or anything is not to appear either with children or with animals. Another one is not to try and appear after anybody like this.
The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and here, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Well, first of all, I hope you heard that. My volume is certainly up as maximum as it can be. That speech was targeted specifically at the Americans. Obviously, it was delivered in Parliament, and it was also delivered on the wireless in Britain. But there were some interesting comments in it. The sinking into the abyss of a new dark age. Churchill knew, because Roosevelt had told him, that Einstein had written to Roosevelt in 1939, pointing out that the Germans had perfected nuclear fission and that the atomic bomb would be a new and hugely more powerful weapon than anything had ever been seen before. So if you like, the race was on, not only for Churchill to get the help of the United States, which of course he didn't get in terms of them joining us until after Pearl Harbor, but also to get the munitions and the assistance and the lend-lease, which of course is what he did achieve. But in that speech, he's speaking not only to the British people, he's declaring the battle to start, and he's talking about what would happen if we failed. So the story of the Battle of Britain has always been given as a sort of David and Goliath struggle between a little island nation, Great Britain, against a massive all-conquering enemy that had conquered Scandinavia, France, the Low Countries, and so on, had done nothing but succeed up until the time it took on this tiny little nation. And we were totally unprepared, and we were like David with his slingshot versus this massive monolithic, hugely successful professional army that was the German Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe and their Kriegsmarine. And that's how the story has been told for years. This is how it's been told. It was told immediately after the battle. This film that you're about to see, or clip of it, was made in 1941. So what you're seeing is the actual people reenacting what had they done a year before. Now, while it's only it's a couple of minutes, look carefully at what they're wearing and how they speak and what they're flying, both the German and the Allied side and the British side.
Summer in Britain. The Battle of France is over. In our land, the unreal peace of a battlefield on the eve of battle. The enemy is only an hour's flight away.
We of the Luftwaffe are ready with our plan for Adler attack. It's a simple plan. Eliminate the Royal Air Force. Its destruction will take 2, maybe 4 weeks.
Northout, Kenlet, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, North Weald, Debden. Will you warn your controller that this looks like yet another attack on airfields?
So that was what they looked like. That's what they wore. I don't know whether you noticed that they were wearing their ordinary uniforms. The Germans had flying suits. We're going to talk later a little bit about what it was like to be a fighter pilot of the period. But that's how it was shown in 1941. And again, that was sort of a propaganda film for the Americans to show them how their potentially very plucky ally had behaved and kept the world free as a result of the Battle of Britain. And in 1969, of course, the major epic movie was made, which had a star cast and was all color, and was the last time that they ever managed to assemble this sort of assembly of aircraft.
For those who fought in the Battle of Britain, it was a battle for survival. For the free world, it was a breathless moment in history. For failure would have plunged mankind into a new dark age. Never have so many owed so much to so few, I presume. For those who fought in the Battle of Britain, it was a battle for survival. For the free world, it was a breathless moment in history. For failure would have plunged mankind into a new dark age. never have so many owed so much to so few.
I presume that there is no one who would deny that England should fight on, even though the remainder of the continent of Europe is dominated by the Germans.
The war in France was over. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. Faced with certain defeat, fighting against insuperable forces, a miracle was achieved by a courageous few.
Great film, wonderful film. And if ever you get the chance, look at how they made there's another film called How They Made the Film, The Battle of Britain. And that's an exciting episode and a talk in its own right. I'm going to be helped in this presentation by these three characters. I was lucky, I suppose we are lucky in a sense, but I consider myself lucky to have been around when the veterans were in their prime, in their 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s. There is only one veteran Royal Air Force pilot still alive, living in Ireland, over 100 years old. But these three are going to help me. We're going to hear from all three of them, and they have three things in common. On the left there is Bob Stamford-Tuck, a squadron commander. In the middle is Adolf Galland, a very distinguished Luftwaffe pilot. On the right is my father, Desmond Dizzy Fopp, an Australian, one of 32 Australians who fought in the Battle of Britain. The thing that they have in common is that when they were children, they all used to shoot for fun. In the case of Bob Tuck, he grew up on a farm. He went into the Merchant Navy as a boy sailor, and he happened to sail in a merchant ship with a captain who was petrified of sharks. So he would send Bob up to the bow of the ship with a rifle, and if he saw a shark, he was supposed to shoot it. Adolf Galland was from quite a wealthy family in East Prussia, and they lived on an estate that had wild boar. So as a child, he used to shoot wild boar, which is, many of you will know, is not the easiest animal to shoot. They move very fast. My father, he grew up on a fruit farm in South Australia, near Adelaide, out in the middle of the countryside. Used to ride to school every day, 10 miles on a pony to school, primary school. Went to public school in Adelaide as an older child, but as a small boy in Australia, South Australia at that time, you would get your pocket money from shooting rabbits, because myxomatosis was a major plague in Australia, still is in fact in many parts, but it was at that time in the 1920s and 30s was a problem in Australia. So a young man like my father earned his pocket money by taking the tails of rabbits into the town with him when he went to school as a small boy, and getting, what, a penny or two for every tail that he caught. So all of them were similar age. Adolf Galland was slightly older than the other two, but they were all in their early 20s in the case of my father, mid-20s in the case of Stamford-Tuck and Adolf Galland by the time of the Battle of Britain. But they'd all got fantastic eyesight, and they were all extremely good shots. And they're going to help me with this talk. So the myths and legends of the Battle of Britain was that we were unprepared, and that this was all a big surprise. When Germany invaded Poland, it caught us by surprise. And then when they invaded the Low Countries and France and so on, not true at all, not true at all. This is a wonderful photograph taken by the Luftwaffe over London of a Heinkel 111. And that Heinkel 111, if it had got that far into London, because of our preparations, it was almost 99% sure, particularly in that weather, of being intercepted as a result of this man. This is Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, who is the Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command. His job was to defend Great Britain. And under him, he had a man called, well, he had a number of people, but specifically a man called Keith Park, who's a New Zealander. And the two of them, prior to the Second World War, had been in research and development. So it was this man and Keith Park who, if you like, placed the orders or made the specifications for the aeroplanes that would turn out to be the Hurricane and the Spitfire. And they also gave money towards the research of what was called radio direction finding. We now know of it as radar. And the world all thinks that Britain invented radar. Not true. We invented, through this man, a system of controlling our aeroplanes as a result of us being able to see further with the radar we developed. But the Germans had also developed radar in parallel. And in fact, when the Graf Spee, the pocket battleship, was sunk in the Battle of the River Plate in December 1939, visible on its masthead was a rotating radar. And we sent agents out from Montevideo to cut it up and have a look at it. And in 1939, in the summer, the Germans sent a delegation to the UK to meet. The Luftwaffe sent a delegation to meet with the Royal Air Force, and at a cocktail party at an RAF station, a very, very senior Luftwaffe officer, standing with his gin and tonic or whatever, leaning against the bar, said to the people around him, "And how are you getting along with your radio direction finding equipment? We're doing quite well with ours." So both sides had radar. The Germans knew we could, I mean, we had radar masts that were 300 feet high, all the way along the East Coast. It was obvious that we had radar. But this man developed it totally in secret, a system of communications which would allow us to defend ourselves in the most efficient manner. But more than that, if you look at him, his nickname was Stuffy Dowding. He was a spiritualist, very well educated. He was a First World War pilot, Royal Flying Corps, very well educated, very well thought of by his men and his staff, but he didn't suffer fools gladly, and he wasn't well liked, but he'd risen to be Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command. And he knew that his Prime Minister, his ultimate boss, who was a Francophile, had, if you like, not done a deal, but he'd promised the French that he would not let them down, and that whatever they needed, the Royal Air Force would provide them with protection and send its aeroplanes and its squadrons to France. But when it was clear that France was going to fall in May 1940, Dowding sent this to his boss. On the 15th of May, he sent a letter to his boss, knowing it would go all the way to the cabinet. It would be read by Churchill. And he said, and Churchill had given a promise. And he says, "I believe that if an adequate fighter force is kept in this country, if the fleet remains in being, and if the home forces are suitably organized to resist invasion, we should be able to carry on the war single-handed for some time, if not indefinitely. But if the home defense force is drained away in desperate attempts to remedy the situation in France, defeat in France will involve the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of this country." So he's telling his boss, don't let the Prime Minister promise things. And to give him his due, Churchill, who, as you all know, was a fine military man and liked to think that he was a strategist as well, and of course he was, and he had huge amounts of experience, never once did Churchill question Dowding's ability and his strategic plan. So what happened? No more Spitfires were sent to France during the Battle of France. My father was there in Hurricanes, but we only sent Spitfires over there from bases in England, knowing that they were superior. So this man Dowding was, if you like, the savior, with Keith Park, who was the commander of the nearest group to France, the group that was protecting London particularly. This is the man who we owe the most to, because of this system that he developed. He developed what's now called the Dowding system, which was to break the Royal Air Force into what's management speak, we'd call manageable chunks. Fighter command was broken into groups, and the groups you can see marked on the map there. 11 group at the bottom right of the map covered the whole southeast of England, the area that was closest to the enemy, because of course by the time of the Battle of Britain they were occupying France, so they were on airfields as close as Calais, Saint-Omer, Amiens, places like that. In fact, when they took off from places like Calais, we could actually see them on the radar. So 11 group in the bottom right, 12 group in the Midlands, 13 group up in Scotland and the north, and 10 group in Cornwall. Those groups were then broken down into wings, and each wing had a number of squadrons, and each squadron had a number of flights. And then underpinning or overpinning that, if you like, our early warning system consisted of the radar I've talked about and the Royal the Observer Corps, as it was called at the time. If you look, they are the masts. They were wooden. The low ones are for low-level attacking, pick up low level, and the high ones are for high level. And by the time of the Battle of Britain, we had built a system of these, we called it chain home, all the way down the east coast of the country. So you can see the dark line on the right-hand map is how far the high-level system actually saw. So anything coming from Norway, from Germany, from the Low Countries, or from France would be picked up by those radar stations. And it's a fact that the radar stations were predominantly run by women. The actual screens were operated by women, because in those days, a radar scope wasn't like that which we see nowadays on a TV screen when you go into an air traffic control tower with a circular loop going around and blips and everything. In those days, a radar screen was a cathode ray tube with a wiggly line in it. And the operator had a couple of large like knobs which she could operate to tweak the signal. And there was an element of sixth sense in it. And her job was to determine how big the formation was, which direction it was going in, and how high it was. That was the information they needed. And all of that information was gathered until the enemy aircraft came over the coast. As soon as they came over these radar masts, which were all along the coast, they were invisible to the radar because the radar only faced east. It was then that the volunteers, as they all were, well, except for their officers, the Observer Corps posts came into being. So on the bottom left, you have a typical observer post of the period. And you have two men operating in it. The one in the middle is looking at the height and the direction. He's got a compass rose on the bottom of the device you can see there, which tells him the compass direction that they're following. And then he has an inclometer, which tells him the altitude they're flying at. The man with the binoculars and the headset on is identifying how many aircraft and what type they are. And then he's feeding that information. And this is where the system gets very sophisticated. We think of the World Wide Web now, of being a sort of web of interconnecting fiber optic cables, if you're lucky in this country, copper cables mainly. That's what was happening in 1940, but it was ordinary telephone lines. And all the information was going to what was called a filter room, where all the various descriptions of what was, because an awful lot of it was duplicated, because more than one observer post could see the same formation. It was all filtered down so that everything that was reported was as accurate as it could possibly be. If you look very, very closely at the chap at the bottom on the right, you'll see that he's got an armband. Now, those of us that are old enough will recognize that armband as it used to be worn by police officers when they were on duty. It was a duty band that policemen used to wear on their left wrist when they were on duty. And when they went off duty, they would go home on the train or the bus or whatever, and they'd take it off. And in those days, the public knew that if the policeman had his band on, he was on duty. If he didn't, he was off duty. They gave all of the Observer Corps special constable status, which meant they could set up their Observer Corps post on the top of your house if they wanted to, in your garden if they wanted to, and they usually managed to get access to free tea and coffee whenever they needed it. So that's the privilege, if you like, if there was a privilege of being in the Observer Corps. But they did an incredible job. And the radar and early warning system that they developed was totally unknown by the Germans.
Radar,
This is Adolf Galland.
a real big factor during this battle. And I can only admit that the German side has underestimated the importance of radar.
And this is how it worked. The sector operations room, which you can see at the top there, and you can see all the women, they basically moved croupier sticks around on a big map of the area that they were controlling, showing the commanders where the raids were coming in. And that meant that we only sent up our aircraft when they were needed to where they were needed. And we called it scrambling them. We got them up in a couple of minutes. They were then vectored, sent in a particular direction. They were told that the enemy aircraft were coming in 20,000 feet. There were 300 of them, and they were told where they would be. If we hadn't had that system, we would have had to have aircraft on what's called standing patrols. They would have been in the air all the time. And the Germans didn't know about this, so they believed that that's how we were doing things. And the other thing about his system, Dowding's system, was that everything was controlled from these operations rooms. So it was inter-service, a very rare thing, particularly in those days. But it meant that the barrage balloons were controlled by them, the anti-aircraft weapons were controlled by them, the searchlights were controlled by them, all from the same operation. And of course, it wasn't just the controlling and the Dowding system. The Second World War in all aspects. We think we're having a hard time at the moment during the pandemic. The Second World War was really a hard time. Not only did the Royal Air Force rely on people in the air, but the whole country relied on volunteer work from virtually every citizen. So you could be, whether you're male, female, mother, child, children went to school, obviously, but everybody had some form of other job. They were fire watchers, they were auxiliary firemen, auxiliary police officers, even the professionals. There was no question of packing up because you'd done your day's work. If you were a post office engineer and the phone lines had gone from somewhere like Biggin Hill in Kent, which actually happened, and they had to move the whole sector operations room, the post office engineers put in immediately a whole bunch of new telephone lines within a day. Electrical engineers, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the Women's Voluntary Service, the Home Guard, all of these people were involved. It was so much a cooperative venture. And when you speak, or when I used to speak to the veterans, the pilots who are always given this heroic stature, they always mentioned not only their colleagues, who they always believed their colleagues did better than they did, they always mentioned the civilians as well, but particularly they mentioned their ground crews. The Germans, on the other hand, had a totally different culture. For a start, women in Germany were not conscripted until nearly the end of the war. Women were considered to be the maternal person, the homemaker, and they were protected. The German Luftwaffe had no idea of the German tactic, of the British tactics, because their intelligence was so poor. They lived in a culture where they had a shoot the messenger syndrome. We didn't. You heard already that what I said about Dowding. In May, he sent a letter which, in Germany, if the head of the Luftwaffe, Goering, had sent something to Hitler saying, "I'm sorry, we can't do this," he would have been sacked, or worse. In this case, Oberst Beppo Schmidt, who was a distinguished Luftwaffe colonel, Oberst, head of Luftwaffe Intelligence, he told them what they wanted to hear. He did an appreciation of the Royal Air Force. They called it the Study Blue. And as far as the Luftwaffe were concerned, as a result of his work, command in the Royal Air Force was inflexible. Formations are rigidly attached to their home bases. See, they knew nothing about the Dowding system. Command at medium level was done by station commanders, quote, no longer accustomed to flying, unquote, and at low level by officers generally energetic, but lacking tactical skill. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. The station commanders were often chastised by their commanders for flying with their men when they shouldn't. The flexibility that you've heard about obviously was considerably more than the Luftwaffe knew, which meant that when the Luftwaffe started to appear over our skies, and every time they appeared, they were intercepted. None of them ever accepted they were intercepted by anything but a Spitfire, I hasten to add. If you talk to any of the, were able to talk to any of the Luftwaffe veterans, it was only ever a Spitfire that shot them down, never a Hurricane. And in actual fact, when we look at the aeroplanes of the period, these are the main fighter aircraft of the period. The Spitfire is the aeroplane at the top right, and the Hurricane is the aeroplane below it, and the Luftwaffe equivalent aircraft are on the left, the Messerschmitt or Bf 109 on the top left, and the Messerschmitt 110 on the bottom left. So a Luftwaffe chap would claim whatever happened to him, he was shot down by a Spitfire because it was supposed to be the best aeroplane the Royal Air Force had. Well, in actual fact, during the battle, 3 out of 5 enemy aircraft that were brought down by all forms of defense, including anti-aircraft fire and air-to-air combat, were brought down by the Hurricane, the aeroplane that you see below the Spitfire. They were comparable, the two aeroplanes. I've been fortunate enough to fly a Spitfire, and it's absolutely delightful. I've never flown a Hurricane, but my father wouldn't hear a word said against them. The Messerschmitt 109 was easily equal to the Spitfire, in some instances superior to the Hurricane, particularly at higher altitude. But the Messerschmitt 110, the bottom left aircraft, was inferior to all three. The extraordinary thing again, and it's a cultural thing, is that the Germans never bothered to test their twin-engine fighter, the Messerschmitt 110, against their single-engine fighter, the 109. So when it came up against the Hurricane and the Spitfire, they realized it was totally outclassed, and it was eventually relegated to very defensive operations. The only aircraft that could perform well against the Spitfire and the Hurricane was the Germans' Messerschmitt. But again, it's a cultural thing. Hitler wasn't interested in strategic warfare. Hitler only wanted to know what was going to happen tomorrow. He was interested in tactical warfare. So his whole armed forces, slightly with the exception of the Kriegsmarine, although even then he was against submarines for the first couple of years of the war, and they were the strategic weapon of the Navy, he would not allow his people to build strategic weapons. So the Luftwaffe was built to support the army on the ground. So the poor chaps that used to have to fly the Messerschmitt 109, the top left aircraft, over England, they could stay over London for 10 minutes. If they stayed any longer, they would run out of fuel halfway across the channel on the way home. And this is Adolf Galland talking about that situation.
Another wingman called, I'm over London. And my red light indicates that I am running out of fuel. What shall I do? The answer was, put your left thumb over the red light. And then he continued by saying, bail out, and you can visit Madame Tussauds Vauxhall this evening.
In other words, they started to use this as a joke. The only way they could keep their morale up was to make a joke of it. because they knew that the aircraft that they were flying was not meant to be doing the job that they were required to do in it. Worse than that, they couldn't produce enough aeroplanes. We always think of the preparations that the Luftwaffe made and the fact that they were massive and so on. This is the UK fighter production during the Battle of Britain. Well, from February 1940, after Lord Beaverbrook was brought in from industry, well, actually he was a newspaper baron, but he was brought in by Churchill to shake up the civil service, to cut out the red tape, and to get procurement and manufacturing working at a level that they knew would be necessary. So if you just look at those statistics, when we talk about the Royal Air Force being on the back foot during the Battle of Britain, in terms of the production of aircraft for it, June 446 in that month, nearly 500 in July, and throughout the battle, the Germans were only producing 156 on average each month. So the production of aircraft was never a problem for us during the Battle of Britain. The number of trained pilots and experienced pilots did become a problem, but that I'll talk about that in a moment. It's also interesting that this procurement problem, and we've seen a certain amount of it during the current crisis, haven't we, and how it's been dealt with by the government. When they specified the aircraft that we've just talked about, the Spitfire and the Hurricane, and a couple of other aircraft of the period, they looked at what sort of ammunition they should use. And they decided they would put 8 machine guns. First of all, they were going to put 4, and then they decided they would put 8 machine guns into their new fighters, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. And those machine guns would be license-built Browning machine guns from the United States. Now, the standard Browning machine gun had a 0.5-inch bullet. You see a picture of it there, but there is a 0.5-inch bullet. We had millions upon millions of rounds of 303 ammunition left over from World War I. So the procurement people in the government decided, oh, well, we'll save a bit of money. So we'll bore the machine guns that we build under license from the Americans, not with 0.5, but with 303, and get rid of all those millions of rounds. When we've got rid of the millions of rounds, we'll put the 0.5s in. The Germans, on the other hand, they had 7.7 millimeter, which is about the same size. There the two are, the same size as the 303, but they also had a 22 millimeter cannon. So in terms of firepower, our procurement had left the Royal Air Force pilots with what you would consider to be less weight of fire. But in actual fact, in parallel with the specification for the aircraft, we'd had a Dutchman come to the UK and speak to the government secretly and say, I've invented a 303 round, the little one, but when it goes out of the barrel, it's on fire. And he was called De Wield. And the British armament people looked at it and said, well, that's a good idea because we've got to use this 303. So we'll have a look at your invention. Thank you very much. And they took it to the armaments experimental establishment and they discovered it didn't work. But they didn't tell Mr. De Wield, but because they liked the idea, they didn't tell Mr. De Wield. What they did was they placed a contract with him for £27,000 to license his invention of the flaming bullet, and then made it work, altered it so that it worked. The reason they did that was they knew that Mr. De Wield would probably also go to the Germans with it, and they wanted the Germans to have something that didn't work. Well, they had re-engineered it to have something that did. So by the time of the Battle of Britain, the 303 ammunition that the Royal Air Force pilots were being given was an explosive type ammunition. So it brought down the disparity between, and these big 22 millimeters, there weren't many bullets of this size that the Messerschmitt 109 could actually carry. So the number that they could use was not that great. And also the other deal that we did that made one heck of a difference between when the Luftwaffe had fought us over Dunkirk, between then and the Battle of Britain, huge amounts of modifications have been made to our aeroplanes as a result of the lessons, and to our tactics, as a result of the lessons we'd learned over Dunkirk. Not the least of which was we managed to get 100 octane fuel from the United States. So we had tankers coming all the way across the Atlantic with very high octane fuel, which gave our fighter, the Hurricane and the Spitfire, a speed advantage which they had never had when the Luftwaffe had met them before over Dunkirk. We'd also changed the propellers. We'd put armor plating behind the pilots. We'd put armor plated windscreens in front of their faces. All sorts of self-sealing fuel tanks we had in our aircraft. We didn't have them at the beginning of the war. We had them by the time of the Battle of Britain. My father will, and any Battle of Britain veteran, will always applaud the work done by the ground crews. The ground crews of the Royal Air Force were like Formula One pit crews. They could see an aeroplane coming in and they could detect whether it needed refueling. Well, they knew it would need refueling, whether it needed rearming. They would rearm it, refuel it, and if the intelligence brief was not included, they could get it back in the air again in 15 to 20 minutes. If an intelligence brief was included, it took about 35. So the ground crews were every bit as important. Our tactics during Dunkirk were appalling. We operated during the Battle of France tactics, which had been developed in peacetime. So we had these wonderful formations of like air show formations of our aircraft. And we operated a system which my father's about to describe for you, where the whole squadron would fly. When you fly in formation like that, you have to keep such a close eye on the aircraft that you're formating with. You will pick a rivet or a hinge or some mark on the fuselage of the aircraft you're formating with, and you will keep that in a single position throughout the flight. So only one person in that formation of Hurricanes there is looking around and looking out, and that's the leader. That was absolutely deadly in the Battle of Britain. So we have a system where they discovered that, so they would send usually the most junior member of the squadron on his own behind the squadron, called the tail end Charlie. Now here's my dad, age 20, a proud young man with his new wings, 1939, with just after the outbreak of war, photograph home for his mum. And he got this job when he was with 17 Squadron during the Battle of France, and he talks about it.
I'd been flying in a position which was very hairy, and it was called Tail End Charlie. In the old days, before we did the open formations, the tight formations were covered by the chap at the back who was virtually a cover for the whole squadron, and he had the job of patrolling back and forward across the tail of the whole squadron, keeping an eye out and letting them know if anything was coming. And of course, he was the first to be picked off. I think I gained quite a lot of experience from that, because I never did manage to get anybody shooting at me, although I did warn the squadron a few times.
So that's what the Royal Air Force were doing, and slowly they changed their tactics to the Luftwaffe tactics, which they had remembered from the First World War, where they flew in what's called a finger four formation with the leader, and they could break off into pairs whenever they needed to. So those sorts of things were altered as we went on. But unlike the Royal Air Force, the Luftwaffe had terrible interference from their commanders, this shoot the messenger syndrome. They were clearly not succeeding. So Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, started to try and find somebody to blame. And he decided to blame the fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe for not protecting the bombers.
The speed of this formation was so low. They were hanging practically in the air, and we couldn't slow down to this bomber speed because we were not any more maneuverable.
So what had happened was Goering had actually told his fighter pilots to come down from the very great height and to sit on the wings of the bombers, because the bomber crews were complaining that they were coming over every time and they were told that the Royal Air Force was finished. And every time they came over, they were met by a swarm of Hurricanes and Spitfires, and they were being shot down. And they couldn't understand how they could be winning this battle if this was happening. They needed somebody to blame, so they blamed the fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe for not protecting them. And the way that they solved this was that Adolf Galland and his colleagues were told to come down from great height and protect the bombers and make them visible. Well, as soon as they came down from a great height, they were vulnerable. They lost the advantages that they would have. Both the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force were made up of the cream of the youth of their countries, respective countries. And there were over 40 countries that were in the Royal Air Force. In the Luftwaffe, they're primarily German. But they were the cream. They were highly educated young men. The average age in the Royal Air Force of a fighter pilot was in early 20s, same in the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe chaps had quite a lot of experience in Spain, but they were all highly clever. Usually they were natural at mathematics, not necessarily scholars, but they had mental capacity, a bit like, again, Formula One drivers. They could fly their aeroplane like it was strapped to them, but they could also take in a situation that was going on around them. But Goering, the great leader, got so angry with them that he actually accused these two men, Mulders and Galland, of being cowards. And he regaled them for hours upon hours and telling them they weren't doing their job properly. At the end of it, he asked them both, trying to be pleasant at the end of this argument, he asked them both if there was anything he, as the head of the Luftwaffe, could do for them which would make things better for them in the Battle of Britain. Mulders asked that his squadrons could be equipped with the latest Daimler-Benz engine for their aircraft, and Goering's aide noted it down and said, this will be done. And he said to Galland, and what would you like? He said, I'd like a squadron of Spitfires, please. And he thought that would be the end of him. In actual fact, he rose to become very, very senior in the Luftwaffe. The few, these young men, well, there were about 3,000 of them. That's the sort of complement of a capital ship, a battleship. 500 of them were not born in Britain. As I said, my father was one of the 32 Australians. They are sergeants and officers, as you can see. They were young. Some of them only had, on Spitfires and Hurricanes, 10 hours of flying on that airplane when they joined their squadrons. Some of them didn't actually unpack their bags before they were killed. It's that sad. They went to a squadron, they arrived, they flew on a sortie, they never came back. They reckoned that if they managed to do 10 sorties without getting badly hurt, they were lucky and they might just survive. But 530 of them didn't. My father was with 17 Squadron, and this picture is, you've seen him already there as a young man. On the right, this is the aeroplane in which he was shot down and badly burned. The aeroplane has his colleagues in front of it. Another myth of the time is that we were so up against it that they did nothing but fly every day. My father was on leave when this photograph was taken in August, but they're in front of his aeroplane. The chap in shirt sleeves, Hancock's, was shot down and killed on the same day as my father, the 3rd of September. And it was a surreal sort of existence that these young men lived. They lived in relative comfort, particularly if they were at an established Royal Air Force station. They had established buildings and everything. They had a mess. They would fly during daylight hours. They often would fly at night as well, would you believe? And if you look just above the exhaust stubs of that Hurricane, there's a piece of metal which shields the pilot's eyes at night from the flames that come out of the open exhaust. They were called blinkers. But it was extremely dangerous to fly one of those airplanes at night. But they lived this existence where they would go down to the pub as soon as it got dark. They'd probably drink more than they should do. They'd wake up with a hangover at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then they would have to go to a diversionary airfield, a farmer's field somewhere, with a bell tent in it and a telephone. and wait to be scrambled and climb to 20,000 feet, fight for their lives, come back and probably do that 3 or 4 times a day in one of the most glorious summers they will report that we've had or had for many years. Glyn Griffiths, which is the sergeant pilot on the extreme left of that picture, was a sergeant, good friend of my father's, a Welshman. He was shot down over Kent during the Battle of Britain in August. And he came down by parachute in a field in Kent. And the squadron was based at Debden, which is in Essex, North London. So his duty, once he was shot down, was to go to a police station and get a rail warrant in order to get back to his unit. So he did that, and he got a rail warrant. He went to Ashford Station, got on a train, I think, to Victoria, and then he would have crossed London, maybe in the tube even, crossed London, got on a train, and then be picked up somewhere in Essex and taken back to Debden. Because he'd been shot down, he would have to pick his parachute up and he'd have to take it home with him, plus his flying suit, his flying helmet, and all his kit. If he didn't take that, his leather jacket and so on, if he didn't take that back, he'd be charged for the lost property that he had. So he's on a railway, in a railway carriage, and one of those carriages in those days, which was a compartment only. And there's a rather sort of, what's the word, a rather high-ranking lady, first-class carriage. He's in this carriage with her. And at the first stop, she calls the guard and she asks if he could be removed to another carriage because he smells of body odor. This is a chap who's just bailed out at 20,000 feet, having been shot down by the Luftwaffe. And Glyn Griffiths was back on his unit, 17 Squadron, the next day and flying again. 3rd of September 1940, 11 o'clock in the morning, this was the scenario. On the right, coming in across the channel, is a German formation. The big aircraft are bombers, the medium-sized aircraft are twin-engine Messerschmitt 110s, and the little ones are Messerschmitt 109s. And if you look at the top right, extreme right of the formations, that's 17 Squadron, and that's my father. And he ends up, and in his logbook, which I have in front of me, it says, Ops intercepted 60 enemy aircraft, 1 Dornier 17 shot down. I was shot down in flames by 3 Messerschmitt 110s, bailed out 17,000 feet, in hospital 2 months. We're actually in hospital 3 months. And in brackets on the side of the other page, he's got 15 minutes on a parachute. He came down in a field in Essex, very badly burnt, unrecognizable. And of course, the propaganda of the time was that anybody who came down in a parachute, even if they were a nun, was an enemy. So the local farmers that were making hay in the field came at him with pitchforks. And you'll hear in a moment, it's quite not particularly clear. He is quoted as saying, what I did was I responded to them in some rather fruity and guttural Australian to tell them who I was. Taken off to hospital, treated for his burns, ended up flying again relatively quickly. So there he is, as a flight lieutenant with his medals and everything on, one of the few, and there he is just before he died, age 85. And this is something quite rare. I got him to actually record his experiences a long time ago on a small little dictating machine, and you won't hear somebody talk about being shot down in flames very often. So here he is talking about it.
Instinctively, I obviously pulled the stick back, and the first thing I tried to do was get out. Realised in the split second that I was trying to get out with all my straps on, so I managed to undo them, got the canopy back, and went over the side.
And on the 22nd of September 2019, we dug up his aeroplane out of a field in Essex. And there you can see the last thing he was holding before he actually bailed out, with the gun button still set to fire. He'd actually run out of ammunition. And when he was attacked by these Messerschmitt 110s, he turned into them, pretending that he was going to attack them, but he had no ammunition left. Top left, that is actually part of the reflector gun sight, the mechanism from that. So what do we remember now?
Gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world. Gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Michael. That was absolutely fantastic. I'm sure all of our attendees will agree. The chat section has been absolutely buzzing so far. So we've got a number of questions for you. We do have some also that were pre-submitted, so I think we'll start off with those. The first question that we have for you, Michael, is it's said that the Battle of Britain was fought on the playing fields of Eton. Is that true?
Well, it is. It's certainly said that's the case, but it's not true. Certainly, a number of auxiliary Air Force pilots of the period came from, if you like, the upper classes, particularly the 600 squadrons of London. But as you saw from the photographs, my father was a volunteer reserve, a weekend warrior. They were sergeants, flight sergeants, warrant officers. Most of them got promoted to become officers as the war progressed and their prowess progressed, obviously. But no, the vast majority we would probably say today were grammar school level education.
Okay, interesting. Follow-up question here: how many of the American Eagle squadrons served in the battle?
Yeah, every time I give this to an American audience, that's one of the questions they ask. None. It was a federal offense for, can you hear me?
Yep, we all hear you. Yeah.
It suddenly went, it was a federal offense for a US citizen to fight for a foreign power. So anybody who came to this country usually came through Canada, and there were actually 11 United States citizens flying with Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain, but there were no Eagle squadrons or United States squadrons. They were formed after the Battle of Britain. But the 11 that fought, they were often, if you like, wealthy or sons of wealthy people who lived in Europe as well as in the United States. One very, very famous one, Billy Fisk, was actually a downhill bobsleigh champion and that sort of level of person. So 11 Americans in the Battle of Britain.
So you say, just on that, you said that obviously it was an offence for those Americans to fight for a foreign power. Did anything happen to them after the war? Were they tried?
No, not after the war. They went through Canada. They were recruited in America. They were actively recruited. And when you think about it, and an awful lot were over here by the time of the Battle of Britain, it's just they hadn't yet been taken and finished their training. Young men were suddenly offered, which my father took advantage of, young men who wanted to fly were suddenly offered the chance of getting it paid for by the king. And they would go across the world to do it. And that's exactly what and other countries as well.
Okay. You talk about the many as well as the few. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, I think it's important to recollect. For example, I talked about aircraft production. Okay, you build 500 airplanes in a month. How do you get them to the squadrons? We had a thing called the Air Transport Auxiliary. It was predominantly men, but it was the very, very first employer to employ women on equal terms and equal pay. So you'd have a squadron go to bed at night, and they'd be 5 aircraft short as a result of what had happened the day before. Next morning, 5 airplanes would appear, and young women would get out of them, having delivered them, or men. I mean, it wasn't all women, but that's what I mean by the many. Everybody was involved. You'd have a job in a factory, you'd go home and have your dinner, tea, and you'd go out and stand on the roof of a building for the whole night as fire watching. Everybody was involved. It was very much a community enterprise. And nobody knew this more than the pilots, because wherever they went, my father was on a train once after the Battle of Britain, and it was obvious from his wings and everything what he was. And fighter pilots used to keep the button of their jacket undone, top button of their jacket undone. And they were like movie stars. So he was immediately identifiable as a young, blonde, tall, mustachioed, 21-year-old fighter pilot. This man engaged him in conversation and told him how wonderful he thought the Royal Air Force was. And my father actually cut the wings off his uniform and he gave them to him. And he said, your job, because he found out he worked in a factory or whatever, your job is every bit as important as mine. I knew nothing about that story until I was director of the Royal Air Force Museum and received a letter with the wings from the man, or from the man who he'd given them to all those years before, saying, if you're the son of this man, he gave these to me on a railway train.
Wow. Actually, you've sort of answered this next question, but did women take part in the battle?
No, women were not allowed into combat roles until actually relatively recently. Women were in the combat theatres of Second World War in the nursing role, and of course in the SOE, special agent role, but no, the women were specifically, when they delivered aircraft, they were not allowed radios and they were not allowed to have the aircraft armed.
Right, okay, interesting. Which was the superior aircraft, the Spitfire or the Messerschmitt 109?
If you ask a 109 pilot, it's a 109. If you ask a Spitfire pilot, it's a Spitfire. If you ask a Hurricane pilot, it's a Hurricane. They were equally matched. The 109 had a fuel injection system, so he could get away from a Spitfire by just diving, and nothing would happen. If a Spitfire or a Hurricane just dived, they had float carburetors. A lady invented a little device that avoided this, but in the early part of the Battle of Britain and the Battle of France, their engine would just conk out slightly. So all they did was half roll. It was easy to get round. So that was one of the differences. We had the 100 octane fuel I mentioned. The Messerschmitt could not turn as tight as the Spitfire, and various other things. But I think the Spitfire was probably superior because it had such wonderful handling characteristics, and also the canopy had no obstructions. The Messerschmitt 109 is like sitting inside a greenhouse. You've got frames everywhere. Now, any fighter pilots amongst the audience will know that if you don't pick up something when it's the size of a fly on your windscreen, you get shot down. The way they covered the sun was not with their hands, they put their thumb up, because in combat, if you see something and it's bigger than a fly, it's probably got you. So this canopy that the Spitfire had much, much better all-round vision than the Messerschmitt. So the answer to your question is they were so similar, I wouldn't like to say.
Thank you, Michael. Question here from David Morris. Is it true that the RAF were 1 week away from defeat when Hitler stopped bombing airfields and started bombing London?
Yeah, David, it's not quite as clear as that. They weren't that far away from defeat. That's one of the myths that's gone into history, because we were doing something the Luftwaffe wasn't doing. We were resting our squadrons. So when, for example, on 15th of September, Churchill went to 11 Group and was told, he asked what the reserves were, and he was told there are none. In actual fact, there were none perhaps in 11 Group, but in 12 Group and 13 Group and 10 Group, there were plenty. So we never were a week away, but you're unquestionably right. And if I'd had more time, I would have gone into it in more detail. The interference by both Goering and Hitler in the tactics of the Luftwaffe by changing their attacks on airfields to cities as a result of a mistake by a bomber at night bombing Berlin and vice versa London, we certainly would not have been able to hold on as well as we did. And just to qualify this, we won the Battle of Britain. Strictly speaking, the Battle of Britain was not won in simple terms. What we did was we put off losing it long enough for the weather to change from summer to autumn and then winter, and the threat of invasion to recede. And that megalomaniac Hitler was so intent on the Soviet Union that he was planning to invade the Soviet Union, and he thought we'd join him. He thought we would be anti-communist just like him, and that in actual fact we'd see reason and we'd become an ally. So yeah, you're right. But we went a week away. We had reserves that are not really ever mentioned.
Thank you. A question here from Kevin Gates. Is it true the highest scoring Battle of Britain pilot was a Czech pilot called Franciszek, who flew it in the 303 Polish Squadron at Northolt?
Correct, and Flying Hurricanes as well. Absolutely correct. Yep, yep. The top scoring Englishman was a Yorkshireman. He only died about 10 years ago. Yep.
Thank you. Question here from Michael Hoskins. Again, something that you've already touched on, but it would be great if you could just go over it. Why have the Battle of Britain heroes always been referred to as the few, when clearly there were thousands of others involved, i.e. ground crew, radio operators, observer corps, plotters, armourers, etc.? Kind of agreeing with what you said, they were surely the many.
First of all, the country was in a terrible state. We were at war on our own. Rationing was being introduced by 1940. It hadn't been in Christmas 1939, but it was being introduced. We needed heroes. And Churchill's eloquence, and also the propaganda that he wanted to put to the Americans, that, you know, this is what we can do. This little island has stopped this tyrant. So, you know, there is a future in supporting us. They made 20-year-old cream of youth the heroes. And of course, he used Shakespeare, never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few, in his eloquent speech, and that stuck. So that's how they became the few. It's interesting that 56 Squadron, a man called Michael Constable Maxwell, he recounted to me many years ago that they heard that speech in the mess over a drink in the evening after a day of combat. And they heard never in the field of human conflict so much being given away. And he turned to his friend and said, they must be talking about our bar bills.
Another interesting point from Kevin Gates, rather than a question, he says St Paul's Cathedral and Canterbury Cathedral were saved from destruction by Boy Scout fire watchers who threw incendiary bombs off the roofs during air raids. And he asks, what would health and safety make of this now?
Absolutely. I mean, that's quite right. Not so much the St Paul's. They had full-time adult fire watchers at St Paul's, but certainly Canterbury at the Boy Scouts, definitely. Yeah, it was a different world, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. A question here from David Myers. Did Bomber Command contribute to the battle, attacking enemy airfields, etc.?
Oh, I should have made a point. Thank you so much for that question. Bomber Command lost more people during the period July to October of the Battle of Britain than Fighter Command, because they were going out night after night to attack the invasion barges in the ports along the French coast. And Bomber Command was not like it became in those days. It was flying obsolete aircraft. It had already suffered very badly during the Battle of France. It wasn't easy for them to navigate. They didn't have any of the aids that they had later on in the war. So yes, Bomber Command was very, very active in the Battle of Britain. And as I say, their losses were higher than even Fighter Commands.
A question here from Vance. What was pilot training like, and how were pilots recruited for the battle?
Well, Vance, the pilot training was extensive. It took just as long during the war as it did during peacetime. So first of all, they were recruited the best people for the job. You had to pass all the same exams you would have to pass to join the Royal Air Force in peacetime. And if you didn't make the grade, you were recategorized in some other trade in aircrew. So you could try for pilot, then end up, well, it depended what the RAF needed, but you could end up as a navigator, a bomb aimer, a wireless operator, an air gunner, or whatever. Because it wasn't a rank-based thing, you got a sergeant stripe once you became a qualified aircrew pilot. So the training was every bit as extensive. A lot of it was carried out in the United States and in the Empire. So South Africa, Rhodesia, Canada, Australia for the first part of the war. So it would take you over a year to even get your wings, and then it would take you another 6 months to become proficient at operating an operational aircraft. And then you become an apprentice on the squadron. So you'd get more time on the squadron. In the Battle of Britain, there wasn't that enough time. So as I said in the talk, a lot of them turned up from what's called operational training units, where they'd converted onto the Spitfire. They'd already got their wings, they'd flown solo, they'd done a fair amount of flying, but their maximum number of hours was no more than 200. And the number of hours on a Hurricane or a Spitfire was maybe less than 10, which is really, really very low to fight for your life.
A question here from Rob. Would you give your opinion on Lee Mallory's big wing idea?
No, I'll give my father's.
We'll take it.
My father was at Debden, which was at the very north of 11 Group, and Lee Mallory was the commander-in-chief of Air Officer Commanding of 12 Group, the next group up in the Midlands. And for those of you who don't know, his big wing theory was put forward by a very good friend of mine in his latter years, Douglas Bader, the legless pilot, that they shouldn't just operate as one squadron, they should operate as three and all take off together, and then they would outnumber the enemy and they would shoot them down. And that wasn't what they needed at the time. But they persisted with it. And every time they operated it during the Battle of Britain, it didn't work because there wasn't the time. And my father was adamant about this because he came back to Debden just after it had been bombed by the Luftwaffe. They'd been fighting the Luftwaffe somewhere over the Thames estuary, while another group, which was supposed to be attacked by 12 Group, they were allowed through because 12 Group was trying to form up. So he was highly critical. And it shows you again, I talked about the culture of shooting the messenger in Germany. Douglas Bader and Lee Mallory got all the way to Dowding to promote this big wing theory. And it had to be Dowding who said no, but they still pursued it. And Lee Mallory eventually took Dowding's job. And Dowding was actually fired basically after the Battle of Britain. So yeah, the big wing theory worked very well later in the war, but during the Battle of Britain, there just wasn't the time for it to form up.
Thank you. A question here from Guillermo. He says, I've never heard how many civil casualties there were after London and other city bombardments. Is there an official figure that you're aware of?
There is. The Blitz, I believe 21,000 in London. But the figures are easily obtainable, and they're obtainable because don't forget, it wasn't just London that was blitzed. Coventry was blitzed. That introduced a new word into the dictionary, to be Coventryized. Liverpool, Bristol, Southampton, Portsmouth, so many cities, a lot of the East Coast cities were blitzed by the Luftwaffe as well. The figures are available. They're in the tens of thousands. And then, of course, there was the second blitzes with the vengeance weapons, the V1 and the V2 in 1944. So the figures are available there.
Thank you. Question from Alan. Did any of the, and these are his words, not mine, non-cream guys, I guess the ground crew, etc., get to be pilots? Did any of them sort of advance, or was that sort of a very prestigious role?
No, you could, when Trenchard formed the Royal Air Force on the 1st of April 1918, he declared that the Royal Air Force would take anybody, providing they were the best person for the job. So he was advocating what we would now call inclusion and diversity. So in the Royal Air Force, this became quite a big problem in the 1990s, doing exhibitions when you'd get, the word woke wasn't used at that time, but you'd get public bodies that were funding exhibitions, telling us in military museums like the Royal Air Force Museum that we had to put diversity right through our exhibition. That was almost impossible for the Royal Air Force because they never kept records on people's ethnicity. So there were plenty of Caribbean pilots in the Royal Air Force. There were plenty of, for want of a better word, working class boys that joined as ground crew, as aircraftsmen, and wanted to fly, and made that clear to their commanding officers, who then put them forward and they were then trained. I mean, if you take somebody like, let's take a very famous person, nothing to do with the Battle of Britain, Frank Whittle, the inventor of the jet engine. Frank Whittle joined the Royal Air Force as an apprentice at Holton. His potential was realized by his commanders. He was sent to Cambridge to do a tripo degree in engineering, and he was sponsored by the Royal Air Force. He ends up a Knight of the Realm and an Air Commodore in inventing the jet engine from being an apprentice. So that was the process.
Interesting. A question here from Subby. RAF pilots generally received less training than their German counterparts. Did the Luftwaffe lose more aircrafts and airmen due to a lack of strategic planning and leadership?
Definitely. They were every bit as well trained as our people, and some of them significantly more experienced, because let's not forget that they'd fought in Spain in the Condor Legion, a lot of them. You could always tell a Luftwaffe pilot who'd fought in Spain. They had a special leather jacket that they bought while they were in Spain. They were very proud of the fact. But then they'd fought in Norway, in Denmark, and they'd been right the way through the Blitzkrieg, successful Blitzkrieg campaign into France right up until July. So that they were just as highly trained, if not more highly trained and experienced than our people. But the interference from their commanders was significant, and it hampered them significantly during the battle.
Interesting. Question here from Harry. Is it true to your knowledge that Air Chief Hugh Dowding claims that he saw the spirits of pilots who lost their lives during the battle?
Yes, as I said, when I talked about him, he was a spiritualist, and he did indeed say that. I met him, in the 1960s. He was greatly admired and loved by those that knew him. But yes, he was a spiritualist, and he did believe that.
A question here from Eves. Is it correct that Belgian pilots were incorporated into RAF squadrons?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of them escaped. I mean, the circuitous routes by which all the foreign pilots got to Britain, none more so than the Poles and the Czechs, but also the Belgians. A number of Belgians, I'm thinking of one particular man I knew, he actually rebuilt a biplane in a hangar secretly from the Germans, and he and a friend flew it out across the Channel to join the Royal Air Force. Yes, there were Dutch, Belgian, Norwegians, Danes, French. I think I said 500 participants in the Battle of Britain were not born in Britain. And as the war progressed, there were squadrons with the flags of 40, 50 nations. The one pilot in the Battle of Britain was Palestinian, for example.
Actually, a follow-on question from Ian, who says, is it true that Polish Battle of Britain pilots were banned from parading in the Victory Parade?
Not just Battle of Britain pilots. The General Sikorski, the head of the Polish armed forces in exile, was invited to be on the dais with all the other heads of the country's armed forces that were in the Allies. He refused because no Polish contingent, army, navy or air force was allowed to parade in the victory parade. And a significant number of them were sent home under orders from Stalin.
A question from Andy. How long after the Battle of Britain and the war generally did the Dowding system remain active?
In a sense, it's still active, but it's copied by every other nation, called airborne early warning. And now we have spies in the sky and satellites and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of the actual infrastructure, right through into the Cold War, some of the locations, if you go into some of the Cold War bunkers today, and when I was director of the London Transport Museum, some of those were part of the LT, one of them was part of the LT system. You can see the same layout laid out for Europe as we had that was laid out for England during the Battle of Britain, on a table with a wall with all the status of our forces and the status of the enemy, just like Dowding invented with Park during the late 1930s.
Got 4 or 5 more questions, Michael, if that's okay. Is there a reason why the Dowding groups started at 10, or was there 1 to 9? And that's from Dan.
That's a very good question, one I've never been asked before. There may have been other groups in the Royal Air Force with those smaller numbers in other countries that we had our air forces in, but I would have to look behind me for the answer to that question, because it's never been posed before and I've never even thought of it. Thank you, though.
Fantastic comment here from Paul. He says he attended a presentation by pilot Geoffrey Wellham at the Chalk Valley History Festival some years ago, and he was asked apparently by an attendee whether the Luftwaffe had a better strategy by firing at the weaker underneath of the RAF planes as opposed to the RAF strategy of firing at the top of the Luftwaffe aircraft. His brilliant response was, "I don't know who had the better strategy, but we won, didn't we?"
Yeah, Geoffrey was a lovely man. It was Geoffrey's book. He wrote his only book he wrote, which is probably one of the best books about the Battle of Britain. My father, who never talked about it, rang me up one day and said, "You've got to read this book." He said, "If you want to know about the Battle of Britain, this man called Geoffrey Wellham's written this book." So I read his book, and then I rang my father and I said, "I know Geoffrey Wellham, he's a lovely man. And how he's done this is that he got all his logbooks out and he went through them and he used them as an aid memoir." "Oh, all right," said my father. So I said, that's when I gave him the dictating machine. And I said, "Now I want you to do it." And he did, which was good of him. But it was Geoffrey Wellham that promoted it. Lovely man. And of course, it wasn't a question of firing at the top or the bottom of the aircraft. They whatever way they could get at them, they would do it. Everything happened. Can you imagine closing speed of 1,000 miles an hour? You know, they're closing. They don't really have a lot of time to decide whether they're going to go behind or above. Or it's whatever is presented to them in their sights, and then they've got to be skillful enough to work the deflection out and so on. Whether the thing's moving and they've got to fire in front of it or above it or below it. If they were underneath it, I think they considered themselves lucky. If they were above it, they considered themselves lucky.
Yeah. Liam Kennedy has said he's lucky enough to live beside RAF Northolt, the Polish War Memorial there. One second. Polish War Memorial there, and the Battle of Britain bunker at Uxbridge. The bunker has lots of info on their website. Is it okay for him to post the link to their website, UGLE comms people? Yes, please do, Liam. That would be really helpful for people. Question from UGLE's Director of Communications and Marketing, Michelle. Bletchley Park is just down the road from her. What is your opinion on the impact they had on fighter and bomber command and their tactics?
Virtually nothing in the Battle of Britain, Michelle. Bletchley Park was just gearing up. They hadn't, and also Dowding was not on the list of people, what they call ultra, the list of people who were allowed to know what was coming out of Bletchley Park. So in the Battle of Britain, nothing. Later on, of course, a significant amount of of information, particularly on the operational statistical side, which wasn't necessarily decrypts of messages. It was where things were happening, what material was being delivered to where, what factory was moving, what submarine bases were being replenished, and that sort of thing, which formed an intelligence picture, which informed the Royal Air Force where to go and look for likely targets. But the Battle of Britain, no.
Thank you. Right, 3 more questions, Michael. The first one of the 3 is from Jeff, and he asks, what happened to Hugh Dowding after the Battle of Britain?
Yeah, but well, he received his P45 3 times during the Battle of Britain. He was at retirement age, and he wasn't well liked by the greasy pole. I don't know if there's many retired Royal Air Force senior officers watching us, but the greasy pole of promotion in the military means that you have a number of rivals. His main rival was Lee Mallory. So he was reaching retirement age, and 3 times during the battle he was offered retirement. He ended up being sent to Washington on a sort of PR job, and then drifted into other jobs in a sort of semi-retired way. And it wasn't really until after the war that he got the credit that he deserved. And certainly Keith Park hasn't had the credit until, what, 10 years ago, when a man called Terry Smith, a financier in the city, determined that a statue is of Dowding at St Clement Danes, as there is of Harris, but a statue is now of Keith Park in London as a result of Terry Smith's fundraising. So both of them were almost not forgotten in New Zealand. I mean, Keith Park was a New Zealander. He's never been forgotten there, but no, they didn't get the credit that they really deserved.
Thank you. I mean, who would want to do a PR job, eh, Michelle? A question from Richard. Did the Defiant aircraft have a role in the Battle of Britain?
Richard, the Defiant, I was fortunate enough to write a couple of articles about the Defiant back in the 1980s, and I interviewed a number of the aircrew of the Defiant who flew them during the battle. And in fact, the Dornier 17 that the Royal Air Force Museum raised from the Goodwin Sands about 10 years ago now, the only Dornier 17, the Battle of Britain Dornier 17 in the world, that aircraft was shot down by a Defiant. So in the Battle of Britain, it lost its way in the sense that the Germans realized it wasn't a Hurricane. But in the Dunkirk period, it was reasonably successful, but they still carried on using it. But it was a bit of a death trap. Not that the crews would ever admit to that, but the poor old gunner in the turret, there was a turret behind the cockpit, no forward-facing machine guns on a Defiant, same specification it was built to as the Spitfire and the Hurricane, but its 4 guns were in a turret. Poor old gunner, he was so cramped in that cockpit that he couldn't wear a parachute in the normal way. The parachute was built into a special flying suit for him. But the first thing he had to do was to rotate the turret so that he could fall out backwards. Well, when you get shot down, probably the first thing that goes is the hydraulics. So in the seconds you've got to bail out, it was almost a death trap in those aeroplanes. So it did take part, it did shoot aeroplanes down. The Dornier 17 is a very good example at the RAF Museum, but it was not a successful aeroplane.
Okay, final question comes from Paul, and it's rather apt, judging by the audience. Did Freemasons Hall in Great Queen Street in London suffer any bomb damage during the war?
I believe it did, but you'd have to check with them because they will have all the documents in the museum particularly, but I believe Great Queen Street was damaged. Holborn area was quite extensively bombed during the Blitz, so I'm pretty sure Great Queen Street was, Paul.
I remember if you ever did the original tour of Freemasons Hall, one of the tour guys was asked that, and he said that there was only very minor damage, a few windows smashed. And he said, someone had asked, was it because the Luftwaffe were all Freemasons? And he said, I think it was actually more likely that they used the tower perhaps as a guide to sort of guide their bombing raids.
All Freemasons were on a list. And if they had invaded, all of us would have been in a concentration camp, every single one of us.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. Well, thank you, brethren, for all of those questions. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to answer them all. I hope you can go away and have a nice drink now. Your throat isn't too sore. Again, on behalf of everyone here, on behalf of UGLE, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure. To everyone else attending, the talk has been recorded, and we will be sharing the recording on our YouTube channel, and it will be obviously free to view in the next edition of The First Rising. So once again, Michael, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. From all of us at UGLE, thank you for those who attended. Please do stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Good night, brethren.
Good night.